Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Going to keep my promise today and do part 2 of my look at the Swatch Group Not Baselworld releases for 2019. Not looking at absolutely everything they've done, I'm just looking at the highlights in my personal and highly biased opinion. My previous video, which I'll have a link down below in the notes, was basically looking at sort of entry to low high end or sort of mid. So we looked there at the highlights I thought came from Union Glasuta, Mido and Omega. Today we're going to look slightly up the chain at Blancpain and Glasuta Original. Now the first thing I should say is the last one was right in my area. I know all those brands. I feel very comfortable with them. I know where they come from. And I'm pretty comfortable making value for money judgments about those watches because that's kind of where I live. I am definitely playing an away game today. The watches we're looking at today, kind of like start at $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 and just head north from there. So I'm going to do my best, but be gentle with me. This is not where I usually play, so it's required a fair bit of research on my behalf. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at Blancpain, and the watch from there, I think is their highlight this year, is the Air Command. Now, the Air Command is a limited edition. They're only making some 500 or so of these, and ordinarily I'm not a big fan of these artificial limits. However, given that this is a $19,000 US piece, I'm guessing that if you want one and you turn up at your dealer with 19,000 US bucks in your hot little hand, you will probably get on the list for one of these. From the little bit that I can see, it's unusual for these Blancpain and other essentially anything but Rolexes to really sell out, and you can normally get hold of them. I think the limited edition is more driven by the fact that most companies don't think they're going to be able to sell lots of them, and so they just crop it off. Okay, so the Air Command is something of a wandering star in the Blancpain range. It first appeared in the late 50s, I think around 1957. Apparently as a prototype that they tried to sell to the US Air Force as kind of a twin to the 50 Fathoms which they were selling to the US Navy. From all reports, it was not successful in that. There was a production run, but the numbers that were produced appear to have been absolutely tiny. So it kind of vanishes in the late 50s, early 60s, only to re-emerge in the early 2000s. This time as clearly part of the 50 Fathoms range. In fact, the catalogs I look up seem to just advertise it as the 50 Fathoms Air Command. And it comes out in both steel and a high value white gold section. So it seemed to vanish sometime around 2005, 2006. And now, 15 years later, it has come back. It's back as a 500 run limited edition, which, as I said, I'm normally not a fan of, but also, given the comet-like nature that this watch has, it's actually strangely kind of in keeping with how it's been managed in the past. It'd be kind of cool if they run their 500 pieces and it vanishes, goes off into the solar system again and comes back in 2030 for another run. There's something kind of romantic about that, and I like that idea. Now, it is an incredibly handsome heritage-styled piece, whereas the early 2000s really took the name of the Air Command and the broad case shape of the 50 Fathoms. It was a bit of a nothing watch. It didn't really carry on in the tradition. This new one clearly does. The new one is a very updated reference to the old version. And whilst it is, as I said, it is nicely updated, you can clearly see the lineage in its design. So it's a 42.5mm steel case, topped with a glass box sapphire and a rotating bezel that is clearly related to, but also an evolution of, the older one. And that's really the theme of this. I think they've really smartly taken the old 1957 Air Command and then brought it forward and updated it and modernized it, whilst at the same time making that lineage clear. The handset's particularly elegant, matchstick shaped hands in white, filled with the ivory toned Now, depending on how you want to call it, you can either call it vintage look or Fotina lume. On principle, the Fotina is unfortunate. On the other hand, it does kind of make sense in this incredibly self-aware 1950s recreation or reimagining. So on principle, I don't like Fotina, but I can kind of see why it might make sense in this watch. Okay, the heritage feel continues with a classic bicompax layout. Again, it's one of those issues where they've butchered the numerals, where they've inserted the subdials, but then on the other hand, that is clearly referencing the old version, which would have been much more tool focused, clearly trying to sell to the military, and all the aesthetics that we care about, like numbers being messed up, weren't a problem for them. So again, it's one of these issues of, if you were designing a watch from scratch, that would be a huge problem. But then given that you're not designing a watch from scratch, the butchering of the Arabics is kind of required, and so we'll give it a pass. There's no date on this, and I reckon that's a great thing. One, again, it's this idea of tying it to the original Air Command, but secondly, it does clean that dial up and let it just be pretty. Okay, despite the heritage looks, as far as movement goes, this is up to the minute kind of modern chrono. It's the Blancpain Caliber 388 Bravo, column wheel controlled flyback chrono with a vertical clutch, runs at 5 Hertz or 36,000 vibrations per hour, which gives the chrono a true 1/10 of a second resolution. Now, if you turn over the case back, you'll see that it's absolutely gorgeous. Okay, now personally, I'm a fan of the prop-shaped rotor, though I understand some people aren't. In my view, hey look, you're spending 20 grand on a watch, near as damn it, you may as well have some fun with it. The second thing is, it's got an aviation history, and how better to link it to that aviation history than through the prop motif coming through the rotor. And finally, actually it kind of makes it easier to see the movement itself. So by breaking up the rotor and not having that big solid slab of pendulum which they normally have, you can kind of see more of the movement. On the other hand, it's a pretty workmanlike movement to look at, and the decoration doesn't seem, frankly, the decoration isn't what I would expect for 19,000 bucks. I can live with it, and like I said, that rose gold rotor is really pretty, and I like it. Okay, so overall, this is a really well-conceived, well-designed, and well-executed update and reissue of a classic watch from the Blancpain range. It stays true to the original and updates it in a really sensitive and smart way. As I said, limited to 500 pieces, $19,000 US. How do you rate value for money? That doesn't seem terrible for this brand and this price range. Overall, I'd say it's a well done, and I think it's one of the highlights of the Swatch group this year, and it's certainly I think it's the best Blancpain this year. Now, when we're going to talk about why I think this is the best update, I'm going to quickly touch on two other updates from Blancpain this year, or two other watches from Blancpain, which I really like, but I wasn't really able to consider as highlights. And the first is the Blancpain Barracuda, which is very, very pretty, carries a lot of the kind of classic 50 fathoms themes across, but with a kind of touch of lightness. It is a bit smaller, it's a bit lighter visually, the color accents give it a bit more play with the red, and it just feels friendlier and fresher than the Blancpain, the general 50 fathoms, which, as pretty as it is, can feel a bit kind of weighty and ponderous. Speaking of gorgeous but weighty and ponderous, there's also the Nergers de Combat 50 fathoms. Now, whereas the Barracuda I think is 38 millimeters, maybe 40 millimeters, the Nergers de Combat is a full 45 millimeters. It is absolutely gorgeous in the way that all 50 fathoms are, but it's massive on the wrist. It would be a very difficult watch to wear unless you're perhaps my size. The thing is, the reason I like the Air Command is because with it, they've avoided the Speedmaster problem. Now, if you've seen my previous video where I was kind of critical of the Speedmaster and couldn't work up a lot of excitement for it, I think Blancpain with the 50 fathoms has fallen into exactly the same trap. They just continually rehash the Blancpain 50 fathoms, and it's a gorgeous watch. It is certainly on my grey list. It is a watch I would love to own. I would love to own it as just in the plain old everyday heritage line. It's stunningly beautiful. But we constantly get these little updates and little spins on it. Each and every year there's a slight spin on the 50 fathoms. And frankly, I've just got this sense of ennui that I just don't care about that anymore. I like the heritage line. I'm going to buy one day, money allowing, but I can't get excited about all these little additions around the edges. I think they should actually do what they've done originally on the with the Air Command, and probably just put a line through the idea of any special edition of a 50 fathoms for another, pick a number, 5 years, and just say we're not going to do one. Put out the good solid middle core line, and then pick a date, 2025, we will come out with something new. We'll run it for a year, let it go away, and then come back in 2030 or something like that. Something to just break up this constant barrage of minor updates and tweaks. The watches are nice, but so were last year's, and so will be next year's. I just can't bring myself to care. Okay, moving right along from Blancpain, now we're going to go to another one of these high-end brands within the Swatch group, Glashütte Original. And the one I'm looking at here, or the collection I'm looking at here, is their 60s collection, the 60s Icon collection, I think it is. And these come in two versions. There's the no date and also the panoramic, which is otherwise known as a big date. I personally prefer the big date, but I'll put pictures up for both because they're pretty similar. Okay, I'm usually dismissive of colour changes. Today I've gone two watches, and in both cases I've said I'd normally dismiss these because one's a limited edition, I'm going to give it a pass. Today we've got nothing but a colourway change, but it's such an amazing colour, I'm going to give it a pass and call it a highlight for Swatch. So what we're talking about here is the fiery orange version, which is, by the way, a strictly 2019 version of the Glashütte Original 60s Icon watch. Now the first thing is the case shaping and everything of the 60s Icon, funnily enough, goes back to a Glashütte Original watch of the 1960s, which was called the Spezematic. That spasmatic shape and the idea of that with the very specifically shaped Arabics and everything was reintroduced in the sort of early 2000s, has been in the Glashütte Original range probably all that time. Spent its early years kind of under the Senator range. In 2015 broke out and has become part of the sort of its standalone collection. I think it's in their vintage collection, and it's simply called the 60s Iconic. As far as casing and case shaping and everything goes, it's a classic mid-centuries watch. There's nothing particularly amazing or special about it. There's really not much to say about the case. It's going to be beautifully finished, but it's, from a design point of view, it's pretty simple. It is, in this case, all about the dial. This watch is kind of like the photo negative of the Audemars Piguet Code 1159. With that watch, it was all about the casing, and clearly they'd run out of budget by the time they got to designing the dial. In this instance, it's, as I said, the photo opposite. They've run out of imagination. They've probably chosen not to use any imagination in coming up with the case shaping. Everything is about the dial, and even more specifically, it's about both the color and the texture of this one annual special that they do every year. Let's talk about this, the texturing first. It's really heavy patterning that comes through that is stamped on the dial by a specialist. In fact, back up a little bit, the whole dial for this watch is made by a specialist manufacturer that does nothing but make dials for Glashütte Original in Pforzheim, and these dials are made using very specific dies which actually date back to the 1960s, probably like a lot of 1960s material. It's all a bit worn, it's all a bit sloppy, it's all a bit non-repeatable. And so kind of like, in fact, much like the Harley Davidson, where shitty manufacturing and poor tolerances is one of the things that leads to that magnificent Harley Davidson sound, it's the same here. Probably some slightly worn blanks, some slightly worn piece holders mean that the dies can move around a little bit. And as a result, you get this fantastic texturing of the dial, but it also means that every dial is unique and no two dials will therefore look the same. Then take that and combine that with an incredibly laborious process for doing the colors on these specials. They start by galvanically treating the base metal. Quick one, what does that mean? It basically means the reverse of electroplating. Dump it in an electrolyte, throw some current through it. Instead of plating it and adding material to it, you actually use that to do the reverse and strip some of the surface electrons away. That can do some weird things to the base metal. Primarily what it will do is change its color, but can also change the way it will respond to subsequent coatings. So that's exactly what they're doing here. So you galvanically treat you stamp it, galvanically treat it, then they start applying lacquer, heat treat, lacquer, heat treat, all of that done by hand, and you end up with this amazing degrade or fade dial effect coming through with all that stamping, and you end up with something which people have compared to the Eye of Sauron very accurately too. I think I read one quote where they said, this is a watch to scare hobbits away, and you can certainly see why. So clearly the headline act, the eye grabbers are the texturing and the colorways, but really there's more to it than that. There's more depth to this dial, this one tiny little sheet of material, than you'd give credit to. So as well as I said, as well as the texturing and as well as the coloring, you've also got, it's heavily domed. It's then adorned with hand applied diamond cut period piece style Arabics, and then all put under this, again, heavily domed sapphire crystal. So everything is combined to just make this otherwise very simple watch just pop off your wrist. As I said earlier, it comes in two versions. There's a time-only version and then the Panorama, which is essentially a big date. They are different in size. The time-only is only 39 millimeters across, 9.4 millimeters thick. The big date is bigger overall, so it's 42 millimeters across and 12.4 millimeters thick. Gives you some idea of those big date complications. Must add a fair bit of heft to these movements. Okay, the pricing is not unreasonable. The three-hander comes in at $6,400 US. The big date model comes in at $8,000 US. In this, again, that's a lot of money. But for what you're getting and in this segment, I don't think that's unreasonable. I actually think that's, if you compare that to saying, would you like this with all the special attention for $6,400, or would you like something like a Breitling Navitimer 8 for $4,000? You'd probably go for this every day. So this is probably, despite the strange numbers, this is probably value for money at this point of the market. There is another Glashütte original watch, which I'm going to mention again, but I'm not going to call it a highlight, but it is worth mentioning, and that's the CQ 1969. Hey, look, it's a nice watch. It's an interesting take on what they've done in the past, but personally, it's nothing special. I don't think it was even intended to be anything special, but this is clearly positioning Glashütte Original to expand their range and go into divers. And I think this is actually quite a clever way of doing it, which is to get into this world by reissuing an old watch, sticking very close to the heritage. It's not spectacular, it's not exciting, but it opens the door so that the next watch in, say, 2020, 2021 is no longer a surprise. So you can kind of produce a watch back in the 60s, produce a rehash or a reissue of that in the 2020s, and then that opens the door for you to produce further watches later, claiming, hey, we've always made dive watches. So I think it's actually it's an interesting move. but it's not an interesting watch. Earlier, when I did my first video, I actually flagged that I was going to be talking about some more watches at the very high end, and I flagged I was going to be talking about a Glasuta Original and about a Blancpain. So that's what I've done today. I also flagged that I was going to look at other high-end Swatch group watches to see if there's anything else which were highlights that I was going to mention, and in the main there was not. I couldn't get excited about Harry Winston, can't really get excited about anything in the Breguet line, but there was another watch brand that did catch my eye, and I'm going to do a part 3, and it's just going to be to look at those 2 watches. And I have broken them out, 1 because I want to keep the videos a bit shorter, and 2 because I need to do some more research before I talk about this brand, because I'm finding it hard to put the video together, and that is Jacques Drouot. Jacques Drouot with the Grand Seconds have come up with a really, really, I was going to say pretty, but that undersells it, stunningly gorgeous world timer and mono pusher chronograph. They're just utterly unlike pretty much anything else out there, and they've so caught my eye. So they're going to be my part 3, but it's a brand I know very little about. It's not a particularly well-known brand, and getting information and being able to put something together that I'm willing to stand beside is tricky. So it's going to wait a little while. Forgive me for that. So go back today. Blancpain 50 Fathom. Blancpain Air Command limited edition 500 piece recreation of an old one, but really well done, and well done enough that I think it is a highlight for Blancpain, and also an excellent model for how I think brands like Blancpain, brands like Omega with their Speedmaster should be treating these heritage lines. That is, keep to the heritage and then bring in something special every couple of years, not year in, year out, just rehashing things. And the second watch is the Glasuta Original, which is going to sound like a denial of what I just said, but another approach I like, which is have a standard range, keep that standard range, and then have an annual something special. So everything is the same, the brand, the dial treatment is the same, but just say every year we come out with a new color, and this is our color for the year. There's something I like about that. And this year they nailed it with the most amazing orange. So they're my 2 highlights. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. I wonder if you agreed or disagreed. If you think that there were other Swatch group watches from 2019 that were worth seeing, let me know in the comments. I'll see you later. Thanks very much. Bye.